The evening light filtered softly through the large windows of Keanu Reeves' minimalist living room, casting long shadows across the sleek furniture. He sat in his favorite armchair, sipping tea slowly, his gaze fixed on the laptop screen in front of him. The video playing there was one he'd seen countless times before a homeless man being roughed up by a police officer while bystanders jeered and laughed. But tonight, something about it felt different. It hit deeper, stirring emotions he couldn't ignore. His jaw tightened as he paused the footage, letting out a slow breath. This wasn't just another story to scroll past. Keanu leaned back, running a hand through his dark hair, which fell in its usual tousled style around his face. He'd always been moved by stories of injustice, but this time, outrage alone didn't feel enough. There had to be more than just words or hashtag something tangible, something real. An idea sparked in his mind, so simple yet profound. What if he stepped into their world? What if he experienced firsthand how ordinary people the police treated those society often ignored? It wasn't about proving a point. It was about understanding. About seeing what life was like for someone who had nothing left to lose. That night, as the city lights flickered outside his window, Keanu made a decision. Tomorrow, he would disguise himself as a homeless man and immerse himself in their reality. Not as Keanu Reeves, the beloved actor, but as an anonymous figure among the forgotten. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but that only fueled his resolve. This wasn't about fame or attention, it was about doing what he could to shine a light on a problem too many chose to ignore. And with that thought, he set his cup down, ready to take the first step toward change. The next morning, Keanu Reeves woke early, his mind already racing with the plan he had devised. The sunlight streamed through the large windows of his minimalist apartment, casting golden streaks across the polished wooden floors. He moved to his closet, pulling out a set of clothes he'd purchased the day before. A pair of tattered jeans, a stained sweatshirt, a faded flannel shirt, and an old, threadbare jacket. Each item felt foreign under his fingers, a stark contrast to the tailored suits and casual wear he usually donned. Standing in front of the mirror, Keanu began transforming himself. Dirt from his garden smeared across his face and hands, creating a weathered look that made him appear as though life had worn him down. His dark hair, typically styled neatly, was left unkempt, falling into his eyes. Scuffed shoes completed the ensemble, their once polished surfaces now scratched and dull. Holding up a makeshift cardboard sign reading "Hungry, please help," he stared at his reflection. For the first time, he barely recognized himself. This wasn't just a cosplay. It was an immersion into a reality he had only ever observed from afar. Keanu grabbed a ragged backpack containing a few essentials: a rusty spoon, an old paperback novel, and a plastic water bottle half filled with water, and slung it over his shoulder. Taking one last look around his home, he paused for a moment. This wasn't about proving a point or seeking attention, it was about understanding. With quiet determination, he stepped outside, ready to face whatever came next. Parking several blocks away, Keanu Reeves approached a stretch of sidewalk where a few homeless individuals already sat or lay against walls. The city lights cast long shadows across the uneven pavement, and the air carried the faint scent of rain that had passed earlier in the day. Unsure of how to begin, he hesitated for a moment before offering burgers he'd bought earlier from a fast food restaurant. A middle-aged man with a grizzled beard looked up as Keanu neared, his eyes narrowing slightly, but curiosity evident on his weathered face. "Hey, I brought these," Keanu said softly, extending the bag toward the man. For a brief second, there was silence, then the man squinted at him, accepting the food cautiously. "Thanks," he muttered, tearing into the wrapper without another word. The ice broken, Keanu handed out the rest of the burgers, sitting down afterward near an older woman wrapped in a patchwork of blankets. Her face was lined with deep creases, her eyes weary yet alert. "You new here?" she asked, her voice raspy but not unkind. Keanu hesitated, unsure of what to say. He wasn't here to tell stories, was here to listen. "Yeah," he replied simply. She nodded, studying him closely. There was something about her gauzy mixture of skepticism and understand that made Keanu shift uncomfortably under its weight. "You'll learn quick," she said finally, her tone matter of fact. "Keep your head down and don't trust the cops. There's one in particular you need to watch out for, a big guy, mean streak a mile wide. Loves throwing his weight around." Keanu filed the warning away, thanking her briefly before moving on. As the afternoon wore on, he saw the stark realities of street life unfold before him. Most people ignored him, walking past as if he didn't exist. A few glanced his way with open disdain, their expressions cold and dismissive. Once, a pair of teenagers laughed and threw a crumpled soda can in his direction, yelling loudly enough for others to hear, "Get a job!" The words stung, cutting deeper than any physical blow could have. But Keanu didn't react, choosing instead to remain still, his shoulders slumped forward in an attempt to appear non-threatening. At one point, he tried sitting near the entrance of a bustling shopping center, placing his cardboard sign in front of him and lowering his gaze. His movements were deliberate, calculated, even hoping to blend into the background. But the reactions were immediate and varied. Some people walked faster to avoid him, their steps hurried and purposeful. Others muttered under their breath, casting sidelong glances as they passed. A young woman actually crossed to the other side of the street, glancing back at him occasionally as if he were some sort of threat. Eventually, a security guard emerged from the building, his presence imposing and authoritative. "Hey, buddy," the guard barked, his voice sharp and commanding. "You can't sit here." Keanu looked up, feigning confusion. "I'm not bothering anyone," he said softly, his voice steady despite the unease growing inside him. "You're bothering me." The guard shot back, taking a step closer. "Move it or I'll call the cops." Keanu nodded, standing slowly and shuffling away. He could feel the guard's eyes boring into him as he retreated, each step heavy with resignation. The interaction left him shaken but resolute. This was only the beginning, and it was far more challenging than he'd anticipated. By evening, Keanu Reeves found himself near a fountain in the city square. The golden hues of daylight had long faded, replaced by the cool blue glow of streetlights that cast long shadows across the cobblestone pavement. Exhaustion weighed heavily on him, but his resolve remained unshaken. He placed his cardboard sign beside him, its message hungry, "Please help," faintly illuminated by the flickering light of the nearby lampposts. His tattered jeans and scuffed shoes blended seamlessly into the muted tones of the night, making him almost invisible to passers-by. Sitting cross-legged on the ground, Keanu tried to appear as non-threatening as possible. His head was bowed slightly, his dark hair falling loosely over his fascia, deliberate choice meant to further obscure his identity. Yet, despite his efforts to remain inconspicuous, the world around him seemed determined to remind him of his newfound status. A group of teenagers passed by, their laughter echoing through the emptying square. One of them tossed a crumpled soda can in his direction, shouting loudly enough for others to hear, "Get a job." The words stung, cutting deeper than any physical blow could have. But Keanu didn't react, choosing instead to keep his gaze fixed firmly on the ground. This wasn't about pride or dignity, it was about understanding. Each insult, each act of cruelty added another layer to the tapestry of experiences he was weaving together in his mind. Still, the weight of it all began to press down on him, threatening to overwhelm even his steely determination. As time wore on, Keanu noticed a security guard approaching from the entrance of a bustling shopping center. The man's presence was imposing, his uniform crisp, his posture rigid, exuding an air of authority that demanded attention. Stopping just a few feet away, the guard barked out an order, his voice sharp and commanding. "Hey, buddy, you can't sit here." Keanu looked up slowly, feigning confusion. "I'm not bothering anyone," he replied softly, his tone measured and calm. "You're bothering me." The guard shot back, taking a step closer. His eyes narrowed, scanning Keanu's disheveled appearance with thinly veiled disdain. "Move either, I'll call the cops." Keanu nodded silently, standing to gather his things. As he shuffled away, he could feel the guard's eyes boring into his back, ensuring compliance. The interaction left him shaken but resolute. This was only the beginning, and it was far more challenging than he'd anticipated. As night fell, Keanu Reeves found himself by a fountain in the city square. The golden daylight had faded, leaving only the cool glow of streetlights casting long shadows. Tired yet resolute, Keanu placed his cardboard sign beside him, its message, "Hungry, please help," faintly illuminated by the flickering streetlights. His worn jeans and scuffed shoes blended into the night, making him nearly invisible to passers-by. Sitting cross-legged, he tried to appear non-threatening. His dark hair fell over his face, obscuring his identity, but the world seemed determined to remind him of his status. A group of teenagers passed, laughing loudly. One threw a crumpled soda can his way, shouting, "Get a job." The words cut deep, but Keanu remained silent, focusing on the ground. Each insult added to the tapestry of experiences he was collecting. The weight of it all pressed on him, threatening his resolve. Keanu noticed a police officer patrolling the area, tall and broad-shouldered, exuding authority. His eyes scanned the square, and Keanu felt his stomach tighten as the officer's gaze landed on him. The silence felt heavy. Then the officer approached, boots clicking sharply against the pavement. "Hey, you!" he barked. Keanu looked up slowly. "What are you doing here?" the officer demanded. "Do you have ID?" "No, sir," Keanu replied quietly. The officer smirked. "Big surprise," he muttered, stepping closer. "It's illegal to loiter here, you know." Keanu frowned. "I wasn't aware," he said softly. "Well, now you are," the officer snapped. "Pack up and move along." Keanu nodded and began gathering his things slowly. The officer's patience wore thin. "Move it faster," he growled. "I don't have all night." As Keanu stood, the officer grabbed his backpack. "What's in here?" he demanded, unzipping it before Keanu could respond. "Just my things," Keanu said. The officer pulled out a battered paperback and sneered. "A book? What, you're a scholar now?" He tossed it aside and pulled out a rusty spoon. "Your fine dining set?" he mocked. Keanu remained silent as the officer continued, calling him pathetic and tossing his backpack onto the ground. "No job, no home, nothing to your name. You're just taking up space." A crowd gathered at a distance, watching with curiosity and indifference. The officer noticed and straightened, raising his voice. "This is the problem with this city," he declared, gesturing wildly. "People like you think you can sit around doing nothing and expect others to clean up your mess." Keanu's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, knowing he had to maintain his composure. "Turn around," the officer ordered, pulling out handcuffs. "What's the charge?" Keanu asked calmly, his heart racing beneath his calm exterior. The officer smirked. "I don't need a reason. You're a public nuisance, that's enough for me." Keanu complied, and the cold handcuffs snapped tightly around his wrists. The officer shoved him forward, making him stumble slightly. "Let's take a little walk," he said, gripping Keanu's arm with unnecessary force. As they passed the onlookers, the officer glanced around, daring anyone to challenge him. No one did. Thrust into the back of a patrol car, Keanu glimpsed his reflection in the rearview mirror. The man staring back looked defeated, but his eyes burned with quiet determination. He knew this was only the beginning. Shoved into the back of a patrol car, Keanu Reeves caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror. The man staring back at him looked small and defeated, his tattered jeans and scuffed shoes blending seamlessly into the muted tones of the night. Yet, despite the physical discomfort, his eyes burned with quiet determination, a reminder that this wasn't just about him. It was about understanding the countless others who endured such treatment every day without anyone to tell their story. The ride to the station was silent, save for the occasional muttered comment from the officers in the front seat. Their laughter echoed through the confined space, each snide remark cutting deeper than any physical blow could have. "Another vagrant," one of them sneered, pulling out his phone to snap a photo. "Got to get a pic of this for the wall of shame." Keanu felt a wave of humiliation wash over him, but he forced himself to remain composed. This wasn't just about him, it was about exposing the harsh realities faced by those society often ignored. As they arrived at the station, fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the stark interior. He was led inside, his wrists still bound tightly by the handcuffs, and made to stand against a wall while the officers filled out paperwork and exchanged jokes at his expense. "You think you're better than us?" the older officer taunted, leaning close. His voice dripped with contempt. "You're nothing, just another piece of trash on the street." Keanu didn't respond, choosing instead to focus inward. Each insult added another layer to the tapestry of experiences he was weaving together in his mind. This wasn't an isolated incident, it was a routine, a system designed to strip people of their dignity and reduce them to mere statistics or nuisances. For the first time, he truly understood what it meant to be treated as less than human. Eventually, he was ushered into a cold holding cell, its metal bench unforgiving beneath his weary body. The air smelled faintly of bleach, sweat, and despair, a suffocating mix that seemed to cling to everything within these walls. His wrist bore angry red marks from the handcuffs, and his shoulders ached from the rough treatment he'd endured. Closing his eyes, he tried to process the events of the night. It wasn't the physical discomfort that bothered him most, it was the psychological weight of the experience. Time seemed to crawl in the dimly lit cell. Every sound, the distant chatter of officers, the occasional clanging of metal doors felt amplified, reminding him that he was utterly alone in this place. But even in solitude, his resolve only grew stronger. He had come here to understand, and now he was beginning to see the full extent of what needed to change. Hours passed in the dimly lit holding cell, each second stretching into an eternity. Keanu Reeves sat quietly on the unforgiving metal bench, his thoughts swirling with the events of the night. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting harsh shadows across the room. His wrists still bore angry red marks from the handcuffs, and his shoulders ached from the rough treatment he'd endured. Despite the physical discomfort, it was the psychological weight of the experience that weighed most heavily on him. The insults, the humiliation, the complete stripping away of dignity. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a routine, a system designed to keep people like him invisible and powerless. For the first time, Keanu truly understood what it meant to be treated as less than human. This wasn't just about one bad officer or a single moment of cruelty, it was about a broader pattern of injustice that permeated every level of society. Suddenly, the heavy door creaked open, and 2 officers entered the cell. "On your feet," barked the older officer, the same man who had arrested him earlier. His voice was sharp, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes now. "You've got company." Keanu rose slowly, his movements deliberate. He wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing him rush or cower. As he stepped out of the cell, he noticed another man standing nearby, a plainclothes officer with a tablet in hand. His expression was unreadable, his tone curt but not unkind. "What's your name?" the plainclothes officer asked, his gaze fixed on Keanu. Keanu hesitated. Revealing his identity now would undermine everything he was trying to achieve. "I told you," he said quietly. "I don't have ID." The officer studied him for a moment, then tapped something into his tablet. The silence that followed was deafening. Keanu could see the wheels turning in the man's head as he processed whatever information appeared on the screen. Then the officer's eyes widened, and he glanced sharply at Keanu. "Wait a minute," he said, turning the tablet around to show the screen to the older officer. "You know who this is?" The older officer frowned, leaning closer. His face paled as recognition dawned. "No way," he muttered, his earlier bravado faltering. "That can't be him." "It is," the plainclothes officer confirmed. "Keanu Reeves." The room fell into an uneasy silence. The older officer's smirk vanished, replaced by a mixture of confusion and panic. His jaw tightened as he struggled to find words. "What the hell is he doing here?" he demanded, though his tone lacked its earlier confidence. Keanu met his gaze steadily. "I was sitting by the fountain," he said simply. "You decided that was a crime." The older officer flushed, his cheeks burning red. "I didn't know this." "You didn't look..." Keanu cut him off, his voice calm but firm. "You didn't care who I was because to you, I was just another homeless guy. Someone you could push around." The plainclothes officer cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the tension in the room. "Mr. Reeves," he began, his tone cautious, "I think we can all agree. This has been a misunderstanding." Keanu raised an eyebrow, gesturing to the marks on his wrists. "This doesn't feel like a misunderstanding," he replied. "This feels like how you treat people when no one's watching." The older officer bristled, shifting uncomfortably under Keanu's steady gaze. His bluster deflated, leaving only shame and regret in its place. Finally, the plainclothes officer stepped forward. "Mr. Reeves," he said, "if you'd like to file a formal complaint." Keanu shook his head. "I'm not here to file complaints," he said, his voice steady. "I'm here to understand, and now I do." With that, he turned and walked toward the door, leaving the stunned officers behind. He could feel their eyes on him as he exited the station, the cool night air hitting his face like a breath of fresh air after suffocating hours inside. Word spread quickly through the police station as Keanu Reeves' identity became known. The room buzzed with hushed whispers and uneasy glances, the officers who had treated him so dismissively now visibly shaken. The older officer, whose earlier bravado had faltered upon recognizing Keanu, shifted uncomfortably under his scrutinizing gaze. His face flushed with embarrassment and guilt, muttering half-hearted apologies that lacked sincerity. Keanu, however, wasn't interested in empty words or public apologies. He stood quietly, letting the weight of the moment settle over everyone present. "You didn't know who I was," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. "That's the point. You didn't care who I was because to you, I was just another homeless guy, someone you could push around." The plainclothes officer cleared his throat, stepping forward awkwardly. "Mr. Reeves," he began, his tone cautious, "I think we can all agree this has been a misunderstanding." Keanu raised an eyebrow, gesturing toward the angry red marks on his wrists where the handcuffs had dug into his skin. "This doesn't feel like a misunderstanding," he replied. "This feels like how you treat people when no one's watching." The older officer bristled at the accusation. though his usual bluster was noticeably deflated. "Look," he snapped, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "I was just doing my job." "Your job," Keanu countered, his voice steady but carrying an edge of steel, "is to protect people, not humiliate them, not treat them like garbage because they're down on their luck." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. The older officer shifted uncomfortably, his earlier arrogance crumbling under Keanu's unwavering stare. Finally, the plainclothes officer stepped forward again. "Mr. Reeves," he said, "if you'd like to file a formal complaint—" Keanu shook his head, cutting him off. "I'm not here to file complaints," he said firmly. "I'm here to understand, and now I do." With that, he turned and walked toward the door, leaving the stunned officers behind. As he exited the station, the cool night air hit his face like a breath of fresh air after suffocating hours inside. Outside, his friend Sam, a documentary filmmaker, waited anxiously by the curb. Relief washed over Sam's face as he saw Keanu emerge unscathed. "Man, I was starting to worry," Sam said, falling into step beside him. "Are you okay?" Keanu nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, I'm okay," he replied, but it wasn't easy. Sam hesitated, then handed Keanu a small device. "I got it all," he said quietly. "Every word, every action. It's all on tape." Keanu took the device and slipped it into his pocket, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Good," he murmured. "People need to see this." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Keanu Reeves, now back in his usual Aderia simple black t-shirt and jeans, sat at his kitchen table with Sam, the documentary filmmaker who had captured every moment of his harrowing experience. The footage was raw, unfiltered, and deeply emotional. It showed not just the arrest, but also Keanu's quiet reflections afterward, highlighting the dehumanization, systemic cruelty, and indifference he had witnessed firsthand. Sam worked tirelessly through the night to edit the video, cutting between the raw moments of Keanu's interactions with the police officer and his calm yet powerful commentary. The final product was both compelling and haunting. It opened with a wide shot of the city square, the fountain illuminated under harsh streetlights, before zooming in on the scene: a man hunched on the ground, his sign barely legible, as a towering officer barked orders and snatched his backpack. Keanu reviewed the final cut, his expression thoughtful. "This is what I saw," he said softly. "This is what too many people experience every day." With a deep breath, he gave the go-ahead to upload the video to his official social media accounts, accompanied by a simple caption: "This is what I saw. This is what too many people experience every day. It's time for change." Within minutes, the video began to spread like wildfire. By the end of the day, it had gone viral, racking up millions of views and sparking heated discussions across platforms. Comments poured in, ranging from outrage to heartbreak. Activists and organizations working with the homeless community reached out, eager to collaborate. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a shocking exposé of police misconduct and societal neglect. Even those who typically avoided such conversations couldn't ignore the sheer emotional weight of what they had seen. For Keanu, the flood of attention was both encouraging and overwhelming. He'd expected a reaction, but not on this scale. He knew he had to act quickly to channel the momentum into something meaningful. A week after the video's release, he held a press conference, and not a flashy Hollywood event, but a simple setup in a local community center. Flanked by activists, advocates, and individuals who had experienced homelessness firsthand, Keanu approached the podium. Cameras flashed as he stepped forward, but he ignored them, focusing instead on the people in the room. "When I decided to do this," Keanu began, his voice steady but full of conviction, "it wasn't to shame anyone. It wasn't to point fingers. It was to understand. What I found was a system that doesn't just fail people, it actively works against them. And that has to change." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The truth is, I had a way out. I could take off the clothes, wipe off the dirt, and go back to my life. But the people I met out there, they don't have that option. They're stuck in a cycle of poverty, stigma, and neglect, and we as a society are letting it happen." Keanu went on to announce the creation of Second Chances, an initiative aimed at providing resources for those experiencing homelessness. The organization would offer housing, job training, and mental health support while advocating for policy changes to address the root causes of homelessness, from affordable housing shortages to systemic discrimination. The initiative was met with applause, but Keanu wasn't interested in accolades. For him, This wasn't about being a savior. It was about doing his part to address a problem that had been ignored for too long. As the press conference ended, Keanu spent time talking to the attendees, listening to their stories, frustrations, and hopes. He shook hands, gave hugs, and promised to stay in touch. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond the screen. Months passed, and the impact of Keanu Reeves' actions continued to ripple outward. Donations poured into second chances, and volunteers lined up to help. Politicians feeling the pressure of public opinion began addressing homelessness in their campaigns. Even the police department came under scrutiny, with an internal investigation launched into the officer featured in the viral video. For the officer himself, the fallout was swift, was suspended pending the outcome of the investigation, and his name became a symbol of the very issues Keanu had sought to highlight. Some defended him, claiming he was just doing his job, but many others saw his actions for what they were: an abuse of power. Keanu, meanwhile, continued to immerse himself in the cause. He visited shelters, spoke at town halls, and worked behind the scenes to ensure that second chances would be sustainable for years to come. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was meaningful. One evening, a few months after the video's release, Keanu found himself back in the city square where it had all begun. The fountain glimmered softly under the glow of streetlights, casting long shadows across the cobblestone pavement. This time, however, the scene was different. A small group of people volunteers from Second Chances were distributing food and supplies to the homeless population that still gathered there. Keanu approached quietly, observing from a distance. One of the volunteers noticed him and waved, gesturing for him to join them. He did, slipping seamlessly into the group and helping to hand out blankets and warm drinks. As he worked, he spotted a familiar face, the elderly woman who had warned him about the abusive officer. She sat on a bench wrapped in a clean, sturdy coat that looked new. Keanu approached her cautiously, crouching down to meet her gaze. "Hey," he said gently. "How are you doing?" She smiled faintly, her eyes bright despite the weariness etched into her face. "Better," she replied. "Thanks to people like you." Keanu shook his head, correcting her gently. "Thanks to people like us," he said. "It's all of us together." The woman nodded, her smile widening. "You're a good man, Keanu," she said softly. He didn't respond immediately, simply reaching out to take her hand in his. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the hum of the city surrounding them as the night deepened. Standing up, Keanu looked around the square. It was still filled with struggles and stories, but it also held hope, a hope he was determined to nurture. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. As he walked away, Keanu felt a sense of purpose, unlike anything he'd ever experienced before. Fame had brought him opportunities, but this was something deeper, something real. In the quiet moments, when no one was watching, he knew he was making a difference. And that was enough. And that's where our story ends. What did you think of this story? Share your emotions in the comments below. We'd love to know what you remember most. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And if you are in the mood for another exciting story, check out our next video. It's waiting for you. Until then, stay curious, get inspired, and keep exploring the stories that make life extraordinary. See you in the next one.